Welcome once again to the Talking Archive. I'm Josh Jacobs. And last time we were talking with Douglas C. Brown. He's a voiceover artist, production director, as well as on-air personality. And he was discussing the mayhem going on at KROQ during the early days back in the 1970s when they were taken off the air by the FCC. Now, Doug, I was classmates with Eric Nordby's daughter, Rachel, back in the mid-1990s. I think Eric had been manager of KROQ for a while. And when it got shut down, she told me the story about how all his belongings, or a lot of his belongings, were in his office at KROQ, and he was locked out from getting them. And so he had to break in at night to gather his belongings. He was able to do it and get away with it. Sadly, Eric died in the late 80s. He was very, very young. But Rachel was a broadcasting major for a while. She's now working, I think, public relations at Azusa Pacific University. I saw her a couple of years ago. Really nice, very nice person.
This would have been a post-76 fellow at KROQ, right?
Yeah, probably.
Because that name doesn't sound familiar. He's not first generation KROQ.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I wasn't sure.
Anyway, this led me to a long stay at KHJ, and it was interesting because KHJ, of course, this was AM radio was still very important in those days. In fact, the cume of KHJ was the largest in any station in the country, and had ratings very similar to the leading top 40 stations in New York and Chicago and such. So it was still, FM had not really cut into the ratings all that much. That didn't happen until about 1977, 78. So anyway, KHJ was a very successful operation, and this is really interesting. From my point of view, it was very interesting because then when I was hired, I was surrounded by all this top tier talent. Everybody from
Machine Gun Kelly.
Machine Gun Kelly, Charlie Van Dyke. People who, Dave Sebastian Williams, a lot of whom went on, Mark Elliott. Mm-hmm. These guys, they all went on to very long voiceover careers, doing all kinds of stuff. Bo Weaver's a good friend of mine. Oh, yeah. He did part-time at KHJ, and he's had a very successful voiceover career and is still at it today. And so is Van Dyke. So I was very lucky because what happened was eventually the production director left KHJ, and they tapped me to be the next production director because I had impressed the people there, and Charlie Van Dyke said, "Okay, you're the guy." Mm-hmm. So then I was full-time production, doing music quality control, commercial production, promo and contest production, all that kind of stuff. And I got to work with Bobby Ocean.
Oh, yeah.
Ocean is an incredibly talented guy, a real interesting free thinker. And so he and I became the production team at KHJ, and we did a lot of fun, creative stuff. And during my time at KHJ, which started in '74, after they went country in 1980, I stayed on for a year and a half there because I was still doing the same kind of stuff. But eventually, after going through, I was there so like 7 years. I had survived 6 program directors.
Wow. And
because I had to kind of restart, selling myself again, proving myself again seemed like every year or 18 months, there was a new face. Well, and what had happened by a year and a half or whatever in the country by late '81, my friend from Northridge, again, from KCSN, Jack Roth, was the program director at KRLA at that point.
Jack the Hitman Roth.
Yeah. He had followed Art LeBeau. Art LeBeau, of course, had done a lot of work to bring KRLA's profile up. But Jack was the program director then in late '81, so he said, "Hey, you want to come over and help me out here? Let's get KRLA cooking here." So I figured, okay, I'd run my course at KHJ, and so I went over to Pasadena, the original KRLA studios there on South Oak Knoll in Pasadena. So So I was an engineer, but worked almost exclusively for the promotion and programming department. I did all the musical quality control. We were stereo at that point, so I was doing a lot of stereo quality control and such. Not that anybody was listening in stereo, but it sounded great. Anyway, so that whole thing went, from late '81 until Greater Media bought the station. I guess that was in '84. So at '84, they didn't, they were going to go a different direction, so they didn't need me. So that was fine. Okay.
Now, when you went to KRLA, just out of curiosity, from KHJ to KRLA, you'd worked for, I think you said, 6 different program directors at KHJ. I think Charlie Van Dyke was one of the program directors. Was he the one who made you the production director then? Yeah.
He, let's see, when was that? That had to be, that was 76. I guess that was like late 76, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, and then the last program director of the Top 40 was Chuck Martin, who eventually would program K-West 106 in its transition from freeform FM to Top 40 format. And then it only lasted about a year and a half after many promises that Ted Ziegenbusch told me about that were never delivered, unfortunately, for a lot of personalities there. When you came to KRLA, I remember it was making the transition from Hit Radio 11, your Elvis to Elton station, as Bill Earl wrote in Dreamhouse, which was like best oldies geared to a Latino audience from the 50s, 60s, 70s, R&B, to more of a traditional oldies format of the 50s and 60s. How much creative input did you have in the playlist or in that regard with the transition there?
No, the playlist was primarily Jack Roth's call as PD. I mean, I would execute whatever he wanted, and I did a lot of research in coming up with the original singles and all of this kind of stuff to do quality control. But Jack realized that KRLA had always had this really interesting position in the market where they appealed to multiple generations of the East Side Latino crowd. Plus, they were tuned into, from the 60s, the whole surfer thing, the whole Beach Boy, Jan and Dean, Surfaris kind of thing. And, of course, starting in 64, the Beatles with Dave Hall and that whole thing. So they had the East Side thing with the Midnighters and all that stuff, Cannibal and the Headhunters and all those East Side bands. And then they had the whole surf element from the 60s and the whole Beatlemania thing. So he was mashing all those together, really. And I think it worked actually pretty well, putting all those elements together. And you know, he brought in Huggy Boy to do occasional shows, and eventually they got Wolfman to do weekends on tape. I don't know if he was ever live or not. I can't remember that. But I thought that was an interesting approach to KRLA at that point. Jack knew, having spent all his time with LeBeau. But LeBeau hated the Beatles, basically. Art didn't like the Beatles because when they came in to the scene and the whole English invasion happened, it basically killed his oldies but goodies albums. He was selling lots of those albums, and for Original Sound Records, you know, his label, right? And Art just disliked, he literally disliked Beatles and the British invasion because of what it did to him personally, financially, which is interesting.
Especially since the Beatles and the British invasion artists idolized those artists, those oldies but goodies that LeBeau was selling. Yeah,
but at the same time, they weren't selling. His album sales just weren't there anymore. You know, there was, people were more likely to buy the Kinks or the Rolling Stones or the Beatles or Dave Clark 5 or even Herman's Hermits, you know, compared to the stuff, those various artist collections that, you know, he made good money on for many years. So, and I admire him for that, for inventing the whole oldies but goodies thing. He copyrighted the brand name. And those Original Sound albums were really a good value. If you were a music fan, you certainly could get a lot of stuff that you'd find hard to get otherwise. So, it was a good service, but it did kind of fade like a lot of pop stars when the English invasion kicked in. A lot of, American pop stars kind of, took it to shorts. I mean, Rick Nelson, who knows? They all kind of took a huge step backwards.
Yeah, even the Ike and Tina Turner Review, as we saw in the movie, that the British invasion was knocking them off the charts. They were nowhere to be seen. The only ones that were really doing well as far as American, it seemed like the Motown and the Chicago soul sound was doing well, holding its own, but the other artists were not doing that well here in America.
Yeah, Motown was very strong label, and they really they put out some it was good, very slick commercial production.
Oh yeah,
as opposed to funky stuff coming out of Texas or Georgia or something. But I mean, obviously the Memphis Soul, the Aretha Franklins, the Arthur Conley and Sweet Soul music and those kind of things, they cut through. It wasn't like the Beatles were the only thing on the radio, but
no,
I would say some of the more middle of the road kind of artists, were having trouble getting noticed. People who were doing regular, having regular hits weren't having the regular hits anymore. But they still worked as concert artists for years after that. Hell, Bobby V was still doing concerts, in the late 70s and stuff like that. It's not like they died, but they weren't on the charts as much anymore. So I was, and then Jack Roth left KRLA at a point in time, and Jim Pewter came on. Jim had been the program director of K-Earth in the early days, way back when, and in the automated days. And Jim was a real oldies fanatic. I mean, he loved, connecting with people like Johnny Rivers and Duane Eddy and, the Shirelles and all kind of stuff. So that was an interesting time as well. And we were playing still a few currents at that time, which was interesting if they fit. And K-Earth was doing that too. They were still throwing, hand-picked currents. I can't tell you exactly what tunes, but they didn't, jump out saying, "Oh, this is wrong." They would fit in with the oldies. It was funny because K-Earth in the old days, when I first started at K-Earth there, when I was running the automation system, the music was all on reel-to-reel automation tapes that were all based on national charts, basically, and they were. It wasn't very localized. I mean, if there were records that were hits on the West Coast, they weren't always represented on those reels. So that's part of the reason why I think K-Earth eventually, abandoned the automation and the nationally created RKO tapes to be more sensitive to the audience, which is, hey, it's radio. You better do that. What a great idea. Let's listen to the audience. So I used to get a kick out of this, though, because they would play anything that basically made the top 10. I don't know if you remember a song called Dominique by the Singing Nun.
I heard about that, yeah.
That was the number one song at the time, 1963, I think it was. And that darn thing was on one of the automation reels. And I learned quickly which reel it was on. And when I would see it would queue up to be the next song, I'd fast forward over it. So it wouldn't play. So the next song on the reel would play instead, I took great glee in doing that. I mean, come on. It was a novelty record, many years earlier. And I thought, oh geez, I gotta edit this. I cannot stand to sit here and listen to the Singing Nun one more time.
I had a coworker here at the radio station named Bob Holiday, who he said he was at an oldie station, I think in the late 80s. He said there was this awful song. He said it must have been a hit because of Paola. It went, "Oh, Julie." And one night I got so sick of playing it that right at the beginning of the song, he stopped. He's like, "Okay, folks, I'm going to stop the song right now." But you know what? If you want to hear it, the rest of it, just give me a call within the next 20 minutes and I'll play the rest of it for you. Now to the next song. So he plays the next song. Nobody calls up. So he does the bulk erases the cart that it was on, peels off the label. Then he takes the 45 source from which the song came from. And he said there was this narrow alleyway with a window out of the studio, and he dropped it into the alleyway and, quote, lost it.
That's funny. Yeah, there was a time when disc jockeys had a lot of control, and that's what's interesting. Because I was introduced to my jump into commercial radio from public radio was really into the top tier. Moving in with working for people like Shadow Stevens and Van Dyke and Chuck Martin and all these guys and others, that I was pretty spoiled as a production director. Of course, I was producing promos and commercials and such, so I was blessed with having all this talented people around as my pool of talent that I would, voice talent. And in the case of Ocean, a great writer.
Great artist.
And so the idea out there in, Ass Breath, Wyoming or something, where the program directors had a lot more latitude and they could throw the record out the window and everything, that was kind of the state of radio. But I was in a very controlled environment. I mean, the playlist, every song was, considered for its aesthetic and commercial appeal and whether it fit and didn't fit and stuff. So there wasn't a lot of that jive going on of somebody randomly erasing a cart and throwing the record out. That, there was for instance, oh God, Kung Fu Fighting by Carl Douglas. Oh my God. That every time I must have played that song 100 times on KHJ, and every time I pushed the play button, it was like, oh no, not again. But it was a big hit record, and there was no avoiding it. And if you were a legitimate top 40 station, you were basically playing the top 40. And so you'd hear, say, Willie Nelson's Crying in the Rain backed up next to, Aerosmith or something. It happened. That kind of stuff would happen. But that was the nature of top 40 radio because before all the formats got so micromanaged and so micro-focused that it took a lot of the fun out of what was top 40. Mm-hmm. At first it became the top 30, and then it became more like the top 20 over and over again. And then because of music research, which I was kind of in on the very beginning, there was a company called Magid Research that came up with the idea in about 1975 of doing a music testing with the audience. And KHJ hired them, and I had to create tapes that they used to play in what they called auditorium music tests, which would be a whole bunch of, I guess they figured parallel one listeners or potential listeners, bring them into an auditorium and play them all these, 6 or 7 or 10 seconds of songs and have them rate it. Or is it familiar, unfamiliar? You like it, you don't like it, whatever, right? So we got into that whole research-based stuff, which was, it was really funny because in the early days, what Magid was trying to do was to create desirable music categories, like soul or rock or pop or country or whatever, right? Mm-hmm. So they'd have me pick songs that were, they picked the songs and I do the reels, of songs that would be representative of those types. Who knows, Aretha Franklin or Wilson Pickett is a soul record and Kenny Rogers is a country record or whatever, right? Mm-hmm. And so, but unfortunately the audience didn't get it. All they knew was the record. They didn't care how it was labeled or what category it was from. Do I like it? Do I know it? Do I want to hear it again? They did some scoring. They used some semantic differential or some other scoring technique. And so it was interesting because that evolved. Once you realized that people weren't rating by a category, but by individual songs, that evolved over time. So by 1977, 78, that kind of time period, they got into testing individual
songs. This is the Talking Archive. I'm Josh Jacobs. By the way, if you'd like to subscribe to our YouTube channel, do so right now. Also, we're on Instagram at JoshDJ57. We're talking with Douglas C. Brown, voiceover talent, as well as former production director in a bunch of radio stations in Southern California. Now, next time, Doug talks more about what led to the demise of AM Top 40 radio.